I had spoken about the last insurgency in the 1970s, which ended in 1977 with the overthrow of Mr. Bhutto, or soon after. And then from 1977 to 2002, which is 25 years, the wisdom that prevailed amongst the Baloch nationalists was that armed struggle was not the path to take. This was Mr. Ghaus Bakhsh Bizenjo's line, that we should work within the system and within the parliamentary democratic system to wrest our rights. And so they went down that path once the insurgency ended. And for 25 years they attempted to participate in elections, come to power, and try to see how much space there was for the Baloch grievances and demands to be redressed. It is a matter of historical record that they were frustrated time and again. Sardar Ataullah Mengel's son, Akhtar Mengel, who heads the Balochistan National Party, Mengel, came to power in the 1990 elections, but soon fell out with Nawaz Sharif, who was in power in Islamabad, and his government was dismissed, I think within a year and a half, and has remained out in the cold since. And the other governments that followed were PMLN and later People's Party, and I think their performance in office and within the system, as I said, the parliamentary system, terribly frustrated the genuine Baloch nationalists because of two reasons. One, there is a structural imbalance in the Federation of Pakistan. Balochistan being in territory about 40% of what is today Pakistan, nevertheless has only 5 to 7% of the population, scattered, nomadic, tribal. The weight of its voice in the deliberations of the Federation is weak and, for lack of a better description, is often neglected. Now, the result therefore was that those hopes from the system and from working within the system having been frustrated, by 2002 a new generation of nationalists, much more militant, emerged. And that is the embryonic beginnings of the present insurgency. It started from the Murri area. The sons of Nawab Khair Bakhsh Murri, the chief of the Murri tribe, one of the largest tribes, if not the largest tribe in Balochistan. And at that point, they were the only group that was visible in the insurgency. Between 2002 and 2006, therefore, it was an embryonic, incipient kind of insurgency, confined largely to the Murri area. Now, the events of 2006 can be considered a turning point. Nawab Akbar Bugti, the tribal chief of the Bugti tribe, which is the second largest tribe in Balochistan, and its area, the Bugti area, is a neighboring area of the Murri tribe. Now, Nawab Bugti's and the Bugti tribe's record in independent Pakistan was not a militant one. They were never part of any insurgency. And Nawab Bugti did engage within the system from time to time. At one point he was defense minister, and then in 1988 he was chief minister of Balochistan. Although, of course, by 1988, when he became chief minister of Balochistan, he was already alienated from and had alienated his former National Awami Party Baloch nationalist comrades. And so to that extent he was isolated from the nationalist narrative, shall we say. Nevertheless, he was a major figure and difficult to ignore. However, his approach to the Pakistani state always, this is a consistent track record, was to negotiate. So he negotiated Bugti rights over sui gas, royalty, etc., and rental for the land that PPL and other companies were using to extract sui gas and so on. But in 2006, an incident occurred which altered this long-standing scenario. The incident was the rape of a woman in the PPL plant or premises in Sui. She was, if memory serves, I think a doctor or something, and she was serving there. And she was ethnically Sindhi. And her rape, this is Musharraf's time, caused a terrible furore, not only in the Bugti tribe, but in all the tribes surrounding the Bugti area. You know, because if you're at all familiar with Baloch culture and tradition, rape is virtually unknown. Adultery is known, but rape is a very rare phenomenon. And it is considered terribly dishonorable. And any woman who is raped will arouse the tribes in defense of her. And that's exactly what happened. The Bugtis protested in their, again, traditional manner with arms in hand. The Domkis, who are another adjoining tribe, the Ketrans, another adjoining tribe, these are all tribes around. And of course, Maris. They all protested against this rape and wanted to actually surround the plant and get hold of the perpetrator. Very murky goings on, because inside the premises of PPL, the woman was, I'm told, and the reports say, drugged, not allowed to speak to anybody, and then whisked away to Karachi, and from there abroad somewhere disappeared. So we never got her side of the story, the victim's side of the story. The suspicion, finger of suspicion, fell on a military person who was serving in the area, a military officer. And when this broke in the media, the first thing Musharraf did, because by now the media was relatively free to report, the first thing Musharraf said in response was, no, he hasn't done it. There had been no investigation so far. The victim statement, if it was recorded at all, was not available. So how was Musharraf declaring this man innocent without even the facts being ascertained? That aroused even more ire and even more anger. So there were clashes between the security forces and these tribes that were agitated because of this issue. Those escalated, and they reached a point where Musharraf ordered the army to take action against these tribes. And in that action, the other tribes retreated, so the main sort of thrust of the counterattack, if you like, fell on the Bugti tribe. And particularly Dera Bugti, which was Nawab Akbar Khan Bugti's home and the sort of main town or head office of the Bugti area. She was Sindhi. She wasn't Baloch. But I've told you about the very close relationships, like lips and teeth between the Baloch and the Sindhi, historically. So the fact that she was Sindhi made no difference. The culture being such, protective of women from rape and this kind of thing. Now the army bombarded Dera Bugti and almost killed Akbar Khan, who then, to save himself, retreated from Dera Bugti and took refuge in the adjoining Murree area, where he was invited and offered safe haven by the insurgents. Okay? And the report is that he was hiding in a cave. And again, the story is very murky, because one report is that the army sent feelers to negotiate with him, and while they were negotiating, a bomb went off and he was killed in the cave. And the other report is no, a missile was fired which hit the cave and it collapsed on him and he died. Whatever the circumstances, which are yet to be established beyond any shadow of doubt, Akbar Khan was killed. Now that was a turning point, because the feeling amongst the Baloch was, not just nationalists or militant nationalists, that this was crossing a line. Killing a major figure of a major tribe, an old man who could barely walk, And someone who had never been a militant or a rebel, someone who remained within the system and always negotiated, killing him was in a sense, crossing the line, crossing the red line, so to speak. So what happened was that the Bugti tribe, which as I told you was never part of any insurgency or rebellion in the past, there was a revolt in the Bugti tribe. And the person who led that revolt was Nawab Akbar Khan Bugti's grandson, Bramdagh Bugti. And why the grandson? Because he was the heir apparent. The eldest son of Akbar Bugti, Salim, had died some years ago. So he was the heir apparent and would have taken over the tribe once his grandfather died. So he led that revolt. So action started, between the army and security forces and the Bugti tribesmen. Although Bramdagh escaped from there because I think the situation became untenable for him to stay and landed up eventually in Afghanistan, and then under pressure from Pakistan left Afghanistan and went to Geneva, where I believe he still is. These events evoked a rebellion in other parts of Balochistan also. So now you have a situation where there are groups fighting in Jalawan, which I told you is the central mountain massif, in Makran, which is the coastal area, in Torbat, Kech, Chaghi, Noshki, all over the place there are now groups dotted over the Balochistan landscape. So it's not just a Mari insurgency anymore. It's a Mari, Bugti and various other tribes insurgency. And what distinguishes the insurgency in the south from the insurgency, say, in the Mari Bugti area, is that whereas these insurgencies are still led by the sons of tribal chiefs, or grandsons in this case, the Bugti case, the insurgencies in the south, because there's a different structure there, and I'll explain that in a minute. Those insurgencies and those groups are largely being led by middle class people, not tribal chiefs or their sons. So this is a new phenomenon in Balochistan's long history of insurgencies, of which this is the fifth one since Pakistan came into being. Dr. Allah Nazir, for example, who is operating in the Jalawan area and southern areas, is a doctor by profession, somebody who was picked up, as so many others were, almost all nationalists run that risk in Balochistan, was picked up, tortured, served jail, and then came out. And once he came out, he organized his group. And so he's one of the main fighting forces now. The problem of the Baloch insurgency always has been, historically, its lack of unity and therefore lack of central command. In the 70s insurgency in which we were involved, we also faced this problem. I told you that when the resistance to Bhutto's military campaign began in 1973, there were 12 groups operating throughout Balochistan, of which we were one. And even in our own area, Mari area, we were only one of 8 groups that were operating autonomously. So when the other 11 collapsed over time, incrementally, these 8 came under our command incrementally. And by the end, by say 1974-75, we were virtually the only group fighting in Balochistan. And even then, despite the fact that they had either collapsed or been defeated and had fled to Afghanistan, none of the other groups were prepared for unity in a meaningful organizational political sense and an acceptance of a unified central command. Tribal culture and you can say tribal ego gets in the way. Every Sardar, because he's accustomed to being autonomous almost to the point of independence in terms of his power in his tribe, is unwilling to accept the leadership of another tribal leader. So the tribal structure of Balochistan society is a very big impediment in the way of a unified and therefore stronger Baloch nationalist movement. That situation still obtains. Not only are tribal chiefs unwilling to accept each other's leadership, when a middle class person like Dr. Allah Nazir is leading a group, the sons of the tribal chieftains or their grandsons are not willing to accept his leadership. So there's no leader, one unifying command. And the result is that each group operates virtually independently and often at loggerheads with the others. Increasingly, in recent years, in the last 2 years or so, these groups are falling out with each other and are at loggerheads with each other, and therefore weakening the overall unity of the insurgency. Even within the Mari tribe, there are now two groups. The original Baloch Liberation Army, which is Herbiar, and now a new group led by his younger brother, Mehran Baloch, who has refused to accept his brother's leadership. Actually, the group began under the leadership of their elder brother Baloch, but he was killed in mysterious circumstances in Afghanistan. Some say by a NATO airstrike, but it's not clear what happened. And of course, since he was killed there and buried there, we don't know. But his death led to Herbiar taking over command of his group, BLA, and now Mehran has gone off on his own. So within the Mari tribe and within the Baloch movement as a whole, the Bugtis won't accept the Mari leadership, the Maris won't accept the Bugti, and none of them will accept Allah Nazir's and any of the other groups. So they're at loggerheads, and it is the usual problem which is available from the history of Baloch insurgencies in the last 67, 68 years, that there is no unified movement. The result is that whereas I had said earlier that the voice of the Baloch is weak in the Federation of Pakistan for demographic and other reasons, this weakens it even further. And so you get a situation where there is no incentive for the state of Pakistan to negotiate with any of these groups. They feel that, obviously they have superior force at their command. And when the movement splinters or is unable to unify under one command, then the possibility of picking off groups one by one remains on the radar. And that is a disincentive, if anything, for going to the negotiating table. They may still pay lip service to it, but nothing effective has been done to bring that about. The government that came to power in the 2013 elections, led by a moderate nationalist, Dr. Abdul Malik Baloch, who belongs to the National Party, which is Bizenjo's successor party. And his son Hassel Bizenjo leads it. He's a senator. That came to power in a coalition with the PMLN, which has more seats in the assembly. But Nawaz Sharif, wisely I think, decided that it was better to let the National Party, the NP, have the chief ministership and to produce a coalition. And the coalition is between the National Party, which is the minority party in the coalition, but has the chief ministership, with the PMLN and with the Pashtun party, which is the Pashtun Milli Awami Party, Mahmud Khan Achakzai's party. Okay? And, the way the thing has worked out is the Achakzais have it very good. Mahmud Khan leads the party that is a major coalition partner. His brother is the governor, and another brother is a minister in the coalition government. He's I think the health minister. So you can see that they've got a good deal, and that of course cements the coalition in terms of bringing the Pashtuns on board. Historically, there has been rivalry between Pashtun and Baloch in the formation of governments and in who would be the governor. The formula in the past has tended to be that the chief minister is Baloch and the governor is Pashtun. So they get representation that way. And then in the case of coalitions like this one, for example, the Pashtun parties also get representation in the provincial cabinet. So that's the lay of the land. Now, we've heard all sorts of things about Dr. Malik stating that he was trying to get negotiations going or channels opening up with the alienated Baloch insurgent leadership, whether in the mountains or in exile, self-imposed exile. And he even approached, it is said, the present Khan of Kalat, Suleiman, who is the father of Ahmad Yar Khan, the Khan of Kalat, whom I mentioned earlier, in Ayub's time and later even in Bhutto's time. So this is his son. He's the present Khan. And he is in self-imposed exile too in London. All approaches to these people, including a request to the Khan to mediate, have come to nothing. The reason is that in the eyes of the Baloch nationalist leaders in the insurgency, Dr. Malik, A, doesn't have any power. Even if he makes a commitment to them, he will never be able to implement it because power resides and the way the province is run resides still very much in the hands of the military. Although the frontier corps is up front, but the frontier corps is led by military officers, serving military officers. So the policy emanates from the military. The FC is not an independent force. It's a paramilitary force which is up front and which is of course led by the military. So on the one hand, they think that Dr. Malik is little better than the mayor of Quetta. And on the other hand, they find that it is unpalatable to them to talk to what they see as a moderate nationalist collaborator with the state of Pakistan and with the military. So Dr. Malik's credentials and his credibility with them is pretty low, if not zilch. Hence, all his efforts have come to nothing. So the insurgency sputters on, despite its disunity. The operations of the military and the FC are continuing. And the military claims it's not conducting any operations, but the FC is. And of course, the other paramilitary forces like the levies, etc., are conducting operations. So, as I said, it sputters on. Recently, we've been hearing a lot about railway lines being attacked, and especially power lines and gas lines being attacked. And every time such an attack takes place in Balochistan, the grid gets affected, either the electricity grid or the supply of gas. So you can see that they're targeting infrastructure that connects Balochistan with the rest of Pakistan. And every time such an incident happens, then it hits the headlines. So clearly, from an insurgency point of view, that's the way to go. It's certainly a better tactic than attacking settlers, which evokes the negative reaction, if you like, and deprives them of the moral high ground, which I think they've more or less abandoned as a tactic. Now, therefore, what I'm pointing towards is the similar kind of impasse between the insurgents and the state of Pakistan that we are so familiar with from the past. And the pattern so far has been that when the state tires of continuing with repression of the insurgents, and that usually happens when there's a change of regime, then the state starts to negotiate with them and comes to some kind of modus vivendi. It is never a permanent solution. It is always a temporary, expedient solution to halt the violence and the conflict and the bloodshed. Promises are made, some are kept, most are not. That's the pattern. And so when the promises are not kept or not adequately fully kept, then with the passage of time, all the old resentments bubble and resurface again, because the history of broken promises that I've spoken about in Balochistan's relations inside the state of Pakistan is a matter of fact. So all the old resentments, all the memory of broken promises is revived and given a fresh lease of life with fresh broken promises. This has been the pattern, and this, in my view, continues to be the pattern. It is very difficult to persuade the military, and I've tried I've had conversations with them, to get them to understand that this is not a problem that is the same as the terrorism they're facing from TTP and other groups. Why? This is a political issue. If it has taken armed form, it's because there's been no accommodation. Even the doable addressing of grievances has never seriously and consistently been applied. Had that been done years ago, perhaps we wouldn't be standing again where we are. In the case of the TTP and the jihadi extremists, they are a religion-based, ideologically motivated movement which rejects the state of Pakistan per se. They want to transform it into an Islamic state according to their interpretation of Sharia, and perhaps go beyond, international caliphate of some sort. You've seen how IS has declared that, so you can see where they're going. Those forces which are so utterly convinced that they're doing God's work are not amenable to reason or negotiation. And we've seen, since this government came to power in 2013, an attempt was made, because both the PMLN and Imran Khan's PTI were arguing that there is no solution through force and military means, and the only solution possible is a negotiated settlement. So they went into negotiations with them indirectly, but nothing came of it. What came of it, while the talks were on, were further attacks, and such spectacular attacks like the Karachi airport one, which invoked Operation Zarb-e-Azb, and the attack on the Peshawar school, which evoked an even further commitment to now crushing these forces. So you can see that even attempts at negotiating with them have not worked. That is not the case with Balochistan. As I've said before, compromises have been made in the past. At the end of every insurgency, there's a compromise. It's not a permanent solution. It's a sort of halfway house. And more often than not, in fact, consistently, it has broken down because not all the promises are kept, or not all the grievances are addressed, even the ones that are doable. Okay, I admit the state is unwilling to concede or even to contemplate the demand for separation and independence. But there's a whole host of other things. That's the extreme position, okay? But when you go to the negotiating table, usually people start with extreme positions. And then through the negotiations, you try to find middle ground, convergence, areas of agreement. It is not likely that people will come to the negotiating table agreeing with each other. In that case, why would they negotiate? So that is inherent in any negotiation process on political problems with political people, political in the sense of even insurgents. Their demands are political. They're not religion-based. They're not Sharia millennial kind of ideas. Okay? They are rights. They're talking about rights. They're talking about the grievances in the past, the oppression, the broken promises, the unwillingness of the state to accommodate those grievances, mainstream the Baloch, give them a sense of citizenship by making them stakeholders in the state of Pakistan, giving them control over their own resources, which is a matter again of history that they have not had, starting with Sui gas and then various others. So there are areas in which middle ground or a convergence is theoretically possible. It has never been attempted seriously. And when you try to persuade the military that this is the case, they fall back on preconceived notions about, a foreign hand, particularly India, supporting the insurgency. Everything here, everything that goes wrong in Pakistan is explained by reference to India. We haven't done anything wrong. Everything wrong that happens is because of India. And it's this, blindfold or blinkers that we wear, which make it impossible for the state to come to any meaningful solution of these issues. And that, unfortunately, is the history of the last 67, 68 years in the case of Balochistan. And, to explain that, you'd have to go back to the narrative that informs the Pakistani state and its institutions, particularly the powerful military, how it sees the world, how it sees itself, and how it explains these phenomena. And it's a very, in my view, a very distorted and rather narrow and India-obsessive worldview. So everything is explained through that prism. Nothing has autonomy from India or the India obsession. And so if you start with that premise, that everything that goes wrong, including the breakaway of East Pakistan, is because of India, India wouldn't have had a chance to break East Pakistan away if you hadn't mucked up. Okay? And this is what you're doing because you haven't learned anything from that. You brushed it under the carpet, forgot about it. Don't even teach your children today that East Pakistan, which is now Bangladesh, was once part of Pakistan. Therefore, how can you learn anything from it, from the mistakes that were made? The Hamoud Rahman Commission report that reported on the Bangladesh debacle, he was the Chief Justice, was buried by Bhutto. And we didn't see it for 15 years, and after 15 years, parts of it leaked out into the international media and then into the Pakistani media. That's how we found out about the Hamoud Rahman Commission report. So you know what I'm trying to say. The state has been blinkered in its vision and has attempted to suppress truth rather than face it and try to reconcile it. Look, I'm a realist. I know how the world works. And I know that when you are suffering from troubled waters internally, there is a temptation on the part not only of your enemies, even some of your friends, to fish in troubled waters. So I do not in principle rule that out. All I'm saying is the explanation that is offered, which is exclusively this, is not accurate, is not truthful, is not objective, and certainly doesn't help you in tackling the problem. I give you an example. Forget the India obsession for a minute. There is now also a narrative within military intelligence circles that the United States of America is interested in the Baloch insurgency and the nationalist movement. Why? Because of the Makran coast. It's very strategic. It's a stone's throw from the Straits of Hormuz, which is the choke point of the Gulf through which the bulk of the world's oil passes. Anybody who controls the Straits of Hormuz or approaches to it can wield considerable leverage. So an independent Balochistan might be able to do that. It would be in the interest, the argument goes, the narrative goes. So the narrative goes that, if Balochistan is going to go independent, if not today, tomorrow, some point in the future, we better get our finger in the pie. That's the narrative. So the United States may be interested. Why are they saying that? They're saying that because the Baloch nationalists in exile have approached the US Congress to make their case. And they have won the sympathies of some elements in Congress, certainly not the whole of Congress. There have been hearings in Congress on Balochistan and condemnation from some elements inside Congress about the policies of Pakistan in Balochistan. So this is being conflated and presented as, US policy on Balochistan, i.e. that they would be interested, if it ever came to the crunch, in a Balochistan that breaks away and becomes independent because of its strategic location. Now, what can you say to such paranoia? It is paranoia.
But you're right, it doesn't solve the problem.
The paranoia stems from not only pre-independence, the national movement, the independence movement. It has carried on. Pakistan has shown the signs of an incredibly insecure state, faced with a hostile, very big neighbor, which it was once part of. And the narrative has been that India has never really accepted the partition and the formation of an independent state of Pakistan, ostensibly for the Muslims of the subcontinent, but in fact not, because so many Muslims are still in India, more now than there are in Pakistan. So the insecurity and the paranoia stems from the way partition and independence came, and has carried on in that vein ever since. And the Pakistani state and its most powerful institution, in particular the military, once the bureaucracy also, but they're not so powerful now, they have tended to, in some senses conveniently, but in practice a great inconvenience, they have always tried to explain all the problems of Pakistan by reference to their India obsession. I give you an example. 9/11 happened. So we were invited to lunch by Foreign Secretary Inamul Haq, and I had the temerity to suggest to him that in the light of 9/11, it was time to revisit our Kashmir strategy. Now we're talking 2001. There's been an insurgency going on in Kashmir since 1989. It has not gone well. And the secular nationalist Kashmiri elements like JKLF have fallen by the wayside, and the movement is by and large now led by and composed of fundamentalist groups. I suggested at this meeting, luncheon meeting, that we must revisit our Kashmir policy because I anticipate that all such movements are likely now to be lumped by the US and by the Western allies into the basket of terrorism. And if that happens, the legitimacy of the Kashmir insurgency will be called into question and we will lose out internationally. I can't describe the response I got. Mr. Inamul Haq went ballistic and suggested all sorts of things about me, my patriotism, and my, to him, unacceptable view. I said, I'm not saying this from a personal point of view. I'm trying to be as objective as possible. I'm trying to point at a possibility. And I think, Mr. Foreign Secretary, really you should take this on board more seriously and respond to it more seriously than you seem to be, because you are falling back on that same narrative that, we are in the right, everybody else is in the wrong, and if you even dare suggest that this might happen, then you are not being patriotic, you're being a traitor. Now, this is the level of irrationality. This is a man who is the top bureaucrat of the foreign ministry. And he's so irrational. Now, how can you have a rational policy emanating from such a setup? And I was quite amazed. Anyway, I left it at that. I didn't want to quarrel with him, but I did point out to him that his response was, how shall I put it, inappropriate and irrational. So I'm just positing this as an example of how the state of Pakistan views itself, views the world. So the way it views itself also dictates how it views things internally, and the way it views the world is what dictates its foreign policies. Why is it that Pakistan is unable to get its case heard, let alone agreed to, in international forums? We are considered mischief makers and a nuisance. We are not considered in international forums, including the US, by the way, as people who can be relied on, trusted, and a state that is in harmony with the stream of history and the way it is going in the modern world. We seem to be some kind of throwback to them. That is what I'm trying to suggest explains why, despite the lip service from Washington, the West, and various other places, Pakistan is losing out internationally. Now, this is something for all of us to reflect upon and to introspect about, because the way things are going, I think Pakistan is heading more and more towards isolation. And the illusion that the historical dependence on the West can now be replaced by dependence on our all-weather friend China may be overstated. China has its own interests. If it has an interest in Pakistan, it is based on its own interests. It's not like, the Chinese system and our system is the same. On the contrary. But despite that, there has been a strategic convergence in the past, which continues to a certain extent today, but it is not all 100% the same. It cannot be. So I think we live in cloud cuckoo land. and our policies emanate from there, we are incapable, it seems, of breaking through the fog in our heads and getting to grips with reality and making policies accordingly in the interests of Pakistan, not against its interests. What has been happening is what is being touted as policy in the interests of Pakistan, in practice is turning out to be a disaster. So I think there is time for introspection.